When you look at the world around you, how do you see it? Do you judge the health of the environment by how beautiful or ugly it looks to your eyes? All around us, we see scenes of cities, farms, and forests. The forest industry stands accused of some very serious crimes against the environment: the extinction of tens of thousands of species, the deforestation of vast areas of the earth, and the total and irreversible destruction of the environment. I've spent all my life trying to understand the land, particularly the relationship between forestry and the environment, to separate fact from fiction, myth from reality. Along the way, I have truly learned to see things with a new pair of eyes. My name is Patrick Moore, and I'd like to share my vision with you. I was born and raised in the tiny fishing and logging village of Winter Harbor on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island in the rainforest by the Pacific. I eventually attended the University of British Columbia, studying the life sciences, biology, forestry, genetics. But it was when I discovered ecology that I realized that through science, I could gain an insight into the mystery of the rainforest I had known as a child. I became a born-again ecologist, and in the late 1960s was soon transformed into a radical environmental activist. I found myself in a church basement in Vancouver with a like-minded group of people, planning a protest voyage against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. We proved that a somewhat ragtag-looking group of activists could sail a leaky old halibut boat across the North Pacific Ocean and help change the course of history. This was the birth of Greenpeace. I spent the next 15 years on the front lines of the environmental movement as we campaigned to stop nuclear tests, the slaughter of whales and baby seals, toxic dumping, and acid rain. By the mid-1980s, Greenpeace was bringing in over $100 million a year and had offices around the world. A majority of people in the industrialized countries now agreed with the new environmental values we had popularized. Presidents and prime ministers were talking about the environment on a daily basis. For me, it was time to take a new direction. I'd been against at least 3 or 4 things every day of my life for 15 years. I decided I'd like to be in favor of something for a change. I made the transition from the politics of confrontation to the politics of building consensus. After all, when a majority of people decide they agree with you, it's probably time to stop hitting them over the head and sit down and talk with them about finding solutions to our environmental problems. So let's talk about some of those problems, and whether they're really problems or just another way of looking at how we live and how we use our natural resources. Every day on this planet, 6 billion people wake up with real needs for food, energy, and materials. And they use a lot of wood to build their homes, furnish their rooms, heat their houses, even write down their shopping lists. Wood is an essential element in our daily lives. The challenge is making sure we have enough to go around, and enough to satisfy our needs both now and into the future. And that's where sustainable forestry comes in. What is a tree? From a practical standpoint, it's simply a large plant that has developed a long wooden stem. Trees didn't do that so we could cut them up into lumber and grind them into pulp. They actually had only one purpose in mind, and that was to get their needles or leaves high above the other plants, where the tree could then monopolize the sun's energy for photosynthesis. Some people hate the looks of a recent clear-cut, but when foresters create openings as they harvest the trees, they do so for a very good reason. The new trees can grow back much more quickly in full sunlight. It's true that clear-cuts don't look pretty when you see them from the road or fly over them in a plane. But look closer and you'll see a new forest taking root. It's young and healthy and will provide trees for the next generation. Forests are home to the majority of species on Earth, from the tiniest insects to majestic mammals. From the bird-filled canopy to the protected forest floor, trees provide food and habitat where thousands of species live and evolve. This gives rise to the obvious concern that if we cut the trees down, all those homes and habitats will be lost and all those species will die. In recent years, we've heard alarmist claims that up to 50,000 species are disappearing each year, mainly due to commercial logging. But is this true? Certainly logging has environmental impacts. When trees are cut down, some animals are displaced and must move to other parts of the forest. But as the forest regrows, the animals begin to return, often in larger numbers. As surprising as it might sound after years of sensationalism in the media, to the best of our scientific knowledge, no species has become extinct in North America due to forestry. Despite all the allegations in the media, the spotted owl is one of the many species that was never threatened with extinction due to forestry. And yet in the early 1990s, 30,000 loggers were thrown out of work in the U.S. Pacific Northwest due to concern that logging in the national forests would cause the owl's extinction. In just a few short years, researchers have now discovered that there are more than twice as many spotted owls in the public forests of Washington state than were thought to be theoretically possible when those loggers lost their jobs. More importantly, it has now been proven that spotted owls are capable of living and breeding in landscapes that are dominated by second-growth forests. Unlike the spotted owl, the red-cockaded woodpecker, which lives in the U.S. southeast forests, truly is endangered, and the forest industry is actively working to ensure its recovery. I'm in the longleaf pine forests of Scranton Valley, East Texas, with forester Joe Hamrick. This is prime habitat for the red-cockaded woodpecker. Tell us about these birds, Joe.
Hi, Patrick. I'm looking at a man-made cavity for the red-cockaded woodpecker, and it's called an insert. And really what an insert is it's a birdhouse that we insert into the tree, which is what the red-cockaded woodpecker requires.
Well, let's take a closer look.
Okay. Patrick, all of the red-cockaded woodpecker trees are banded with this bright green paint. And in this tree is the insert. The insert is nothing more than a large cedar block with a hole drilled into the face, a hole drilled downward. It's inserted into the tree, and the birds will literally move in overnight. In following days, they'll begin housekeeping, they'll begin pecking resin wells around the cavity entrance, and it's their home for life. Over time, the tree itself will even heal over that insert so that it becomes actually a natural cavity.
And it's working really well.
It seems to be working wonderfully, Patrick. When we began the program, there were 4 active red-cockaded woodpecker locations. We now have 14 active locations, and we're certain that this is a result of the inserts we've been putting into these trees, which now stands at over 180.
There is a reason why forestry seldom, if ever, causes species to become extinct. We tend to think that forests need our help to recover after destruction, whether by fire or logging. Of course, this is not the case. Forests have been recovering by themselves without any assistance from fires, volcanoes, landslides, floods, and ice ages ever since forests appeared over 350 million years ago. So long as the land is left alone, the forest will recover, and all the species that were in it will return. Fire has always been the main cause of forest destruction, or disturbance as ecologists prefer to call it. But that's okay, we're told, because fire is natural and doesn't destroy the ecosystem, not like logging, which is portrayed as unnatural. All manner of rhetoric is used to give the impression that logging is fundamentally different from other forms of disturbance. While it is true that logging is not identical to fire in its impacts, it is also true that fire is very different from an ice age, and ice ages are very different from volcanoes. The important point is that forests are capable of recovering from any form of disturbance so long as the disturbance is ended. When the fire goes out, the volcano stops erupting, the ice retreats, or the loggers go home after finishing their work, the forest will immediately begin the process of recovery. And if you don't think fire destroys the ecosystem, you should try counting the species left alive after a severe forest fire. Yet it is often only a few years after such a fire that the land is alive with grasses and flowers again. For total destruction by nature, there is no better place to visit than Mount St. Helens. When this volcano blew up in 1980, it destroyed over 150,000 acres of forest, part of which was federal public land, and part of which was private timberlands. 2 decades later, the federal land still looks a lot like a desert. The government is letting the land recover on its own, which it will do eventually, but it will take a long time for the forest to return, perhaps 200 years. Weyerhaeuser didn't want to wait 200 years for the forest to recover. They salvaged all the dead trees and planted seedlings that were large enough to get their roots down through the volcanic ash. Today, these seedlings are over 20 feet tall and will provide a harvest of timber in the year 2026. The contrast between the federal lands and the private lands offers proof that knowledgeable people can make a dramatic difference in the rate at which a forest recovers from a natural disaster. This area was logged by my grandfather over 60 years ago, and if it weren't for the presence of rotting, moss-covered stumps, you'd never know the area had been logged. It's all grown back into a beautiful new forest again. And today, there are bears and wolves and cougars and deer, owls, ravens, hawks, and eagles living in this forest again. They've all dispersed back as the forest has renewed itself. We've all been taught since we were children that you should not judge a book by its cover. In other words, that beauty is only skin deep. Yet we're still easily tricked into thinking that if we like what we see with our eyes, it must be good, and if we don't like what we see with our eyes, it must be bad. Some people want you to believe that the ugly appearance of a recently harvested forest is synonymous with permanent destruction of the environment. And yet, the unsightly sea of stumps is not some nuclear waste or a toxic discharge. It's actually 100% organic and will soon grow back into a beautiful new forest again. The way we think the land should look often has more to do with personal and social values than anything to do with biodiversity or science. We tend to idealize nature as if there is some perfect state that is exactly right for a given piece of land. There are actually thousands of combinations of species at all different stages of forest growth that are perfectly natural and sustainable in their own right. There is nothing better about old trees than young trees. Perhaps the ideal state is to have forests of all ages, young, medium, and old, across the landscape. This will provide the highest diversity of habitats and therefore an opportunity for the largest number of species to live in that landscape.